Welcome and thank you for registering to participate in our Resilient Farming in a Changing Climate, a Carbon Neutral Future webinar. This is our third webinar in a series focused on supporting farmers to adopt to climate market variability and learn about some of the available tools and technologies. So just to introduce myself, my name's Jenny. I am the ACT Regional Agricultural Landcare Facilitator, otherwise known as the Ralph, and the Ralphs around the New South Wales and Australia. So I sit in the ACT Natural Resource Management team in the ACT here, and my role and this webinar series is funded by the Australian Government's National Landcare Regional Land Partnership Program, and it's also supported by the ACT government as well. So to start with, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm meeting on today, which is the Ngunnawal people, and extend that acknowledgement to the various traditional custodians of the land you are all meeting on today. I wish to also acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and their contribution they make to our cities and our regions. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending this event today as well. So a little bit about the webinar. Today's webinar with Meat and Livestock Australia and MaiaGrazing will look at how the red meat industry will achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. How livestock producers can be involved, and it also introduced MaiaGrazing, an online grazing management tool that can help farmers maximise pasture and profit, which is one of a number of online management tools available. So just a little, I don't want to take up too much time, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we get to the presenters. If you haven't used Zoom meetings before, just remember to keep your microphone muted. And if you are having trouble with connectivity, sometimes turning off your camera will help stream it a little bit easier, and we might not come through as robots so much. There are two functions you can use today. So one of those is the chat function, and my screen that sits on the bottom toolbar. Use that chat function just to pop in there where you might be dialing in from today, maybe the traditional custodian lands that you're coming from. But if you have any questions and answers, pop them in the other function there, which is the Q&A function. That way, when we come to the end of the presentations, we can see those questions quite clearly and not necessarily in amongst the chat function. So we've got Sheeta and Dave from MaiaGrazing operating that sort of back end and the technology. So if you do have any IT concerns, pop it in that chat function, and Sheeta and Dave could hopefully help you out there. So we'll also be recording this webinar, and that'll be used for future use and for those who are unable to attend today, just letting you know that now that it's been recorded. So I guess to our presenters, our first guest today is Margaret Jewell. Now, Margaret is she's the manager for Carbon Neutral 2030 for Meat and Livestock Australia. She also has an agricultural scientist and PhD in plant genetics and over a decade experience in intensive and extensive agricultural. So welcome, Margaret. Thank you for joining us today. By all means, add to your introduction if I've missed something, but lovely to have you here, and we really appreciate you coming on board and giving us a presentation today. So I think, Margaret, I'll throw to you and you'll share a screen, and Dave, you're there as backup to help, I believe.
Thanks, Jenny, and just trying to share my screen now. So if people can give a thumbs up if they can see it, that'd be handy.
Yes, I can see that, Margaret. Yep.
Awesome, great, and thanks for the introduction. I don't really have anything to add. That was great. So I'm the CN30 manager from within Meat and Livestock Australia, and today I'm just going to go through where we're currently up to at MLA in the activities that we're conducting as part of the Carbon Neutral or CN30 initiative. So what is CN30? Well, if you don't know, there's two key components. So firstly, it's an aspirational target for the Australian red meat industry to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So it's not a mandate, and there's nothing about CN30 that is industry forcing any of our stakeholders to make any changes that are going to be to the detriment of productivity and profitability and prosperity for the red meat industry. It's also a coordinated research, development and adoption effort. So MLA's role in CN30 is to support the development of technologies and practices that are going to enable industry to pursue a carbon neutral position. We can't do it alone, and we're working really extensively with other stakeholders that include government organisations, as well as the research partners that we work with, and of course our producer stakeholders as well. So progress towards CN30 is currently measured and reported by the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, which is kept at arm's length to MLA and industry. And of course, when we're talking about the greenhouse gases that are related to the red meat industry, we are concerned with carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, but the big one and the major focus for us at the moment in CN30 is methane, and that's enteric methane, and it comes from the livestock themselves. So we've done a fair bit of work doing consumer sentiment surveys and market research, and identified that there are a number of reasons why industry has decided that setting an aspirational emissions reduction target is a really good strategic move for the prosperity of the red meat industry. So firstly, we want to make sure that we can maintain the support of our consumers and the community. We also want to make sure we can continue to access markets, and being able to demonstrate environmental stewardship credentials are becoming an increasingly important point of difference in the global protein market. We also want to make sure we can continue to access capital, and we're already seeing that a number of banks are asking for evidence of environmental stewardship credentials, and specifically emissions reports in return for access to capital. And some banks are also offering incentives for being able to demonstrate good environmental stewardship in return for loans. We also think that by being out on the front foot and demonstrating that the red meat industry are keen to take proactive action, that we're going to limit the need for regulators to come along and enforce us to take action that we might not be ready to take, or that might be to the detriment of the profitability and productivity of our industry. But most importantly, we want to make sure we can continue to produce a really high quality product in the face of some big environmental and climate challenges that we're going to face in the future. So across all of the activities that we're supporting, first and foremost, we have the vision of the red meat industry that's outlined in the Red Meat 2030 strategic plan in mind. So that is to double the value of red meat sales by 2030, and to do so as the trusted source of the highest quality protein. So now I'll sort of focus more in on the activities that we're conducting as part of CN30. Last year, we developed our CN30 roadmap. It's a great document and it's available online, so I'll encourage you all to go and have a look at it if you haven't seen it already. It does need a few updates. It needs some updated numbers, and we've got some new information that we want to include in the roadmap as well. So it's going to be an evolving document. But it outlines what CN30 is, what the drivers are, and what the benefits to industry are, what the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders are, and probably most importantly, it outlines these 4 key work areas that provide a framework for all of the activities that we're undertaking. So the first work area is industry leadership. This is obviously about building capacity and competency amongst all stakeholders involved with the industry. And we've really got an increased focus of wanting to embed adoption pathways within all of the research investments that we're making, so that we can know that the technologies that we're developing are actually going to be able to be used in a commercial setting by red meat producers. We've got our 2 core research and development work areas. So they are greenhouse gas emissions avoidance, which is focusing on developing technologies that will allow us to reduce the amount of emissions that are attributed to our industry. And we're looking across additives and supplements, genetics and high quality forages in that regard. We've also got our carbon storage work area, which is concerned with increasing the amount of carbon that can be just stored in the landscape through on-farm practices. And then the last work area is integrated management systems. And this has sort of got two aspects. So it's wanting to draw together all of the outputs from all of the other work areas in ways that we can identify packages of recommended practices that are ready for adoption and can be implemented across whole farms and achieve not only a carbon benefit, but multiple other benefits that include demonstrated environmental stewardship and increased profitability and productivity. The other part that the integrated management systems work area is concerned with is working with the federal government and other research organisations to ensure that the carbon market and other accounting frameworks are ready when the technologies are ready, so that producers who are adopting various technologies and practices can be remunerated for doing so through various avenues. So I'll zone in on some of those work areas a little bit further now. In regard to the emissions avoidance work area, we've actually been developing up an emissions avoidance partnership. So this is where we've got a number of research organisations who are co-investing with us on developing some of the technologies related to emissions avoidance to a sort of a big collaborative partnership of work. We've only officially contracted a couple of projects in the partnership, so we're in the process of reviewing a lot of proposals and hope that that partnership will be sort of fully formed early in the new year. One of the projects that we have already kicked off is with a compound called 3-NOP. So you might have seen in the media early in the year that we did a feedlot trial with 3-NOP, and we found that it was able to reduce methane emissions by up to 90%. What we're trying to do now with the CSIRO is a piece of work that's based on some research that was conducted overseas in dairy that looked at feeding 3-NOP to young calves and found that there was a long-term or permanent change in the makeup of the rumen microbiome that was associated with a reduction in methane as well. So we're investigating whether this is a feasible technology for us to significantly reduce the methane emissions that are generated by grazing animals in Northern Australia. You've all no doubt heard of Asparagopsis, so it's another potential feed additive of focus for us, and it's been shown to reduce methane by a significant level as well. We're conducting some further work on Asparagopsis too. This is concerned mainly with ticking off some due diligence requirements, but most importantly to investigate how we can make this a feasible technology for grazing animals rather than just in feedlots, which is where it's been demonstrated to date. We're also looking at genetics. So the use, we're trying to develop EBV, so estimated breeding values, and Australian sheep breeding values for methane traits that can be included in currently available selection indexes to enable producers to select for animals that naturally produce low methane. Genetic selection doesn't have the sort of potential to substantially reduce enteric methane production, but it does reduce methane in a cumulative and permanent way. So it is a really important technology for us to be investigating. And then we're also looking on the forages side of things. So continuing to work on Leukina and Desmanthus and garner further adoption of that in northern environments and explore how much further we can reach in sort of a geographic sense with those legumes too. We're continuing to explore more legumes for southern environments and also multi-species pastures as well. So onto the carbon storage side of things. Similarly to the emissions avoidance work area, we have a carbon storage partnership. But the difference is that it's pretty much up and running. So it's in the very early stages, but all the projects have officially commenced, and we're hoping to have some updates on progress of those in the near future. So within this partnership, so the foundation project for the partnership is a University of Tasmania project, and it's really concerned with this whole farm integration of different technologies that can enable carbon benefit, but also multiple other benefits. We're looking at some fairly substantial soil carbon projects, and really focused on a technology based around flux towers, which is essentially a way for remotely sensing the amount of carbon that's stored in soils. And we're using this to for a few different reasons. Firstly, we're trying to develop a technology that can significantly reduce the costs that are associated with soil carbon measurement. We're also using it to explore how much soil carbon can be built up in response to different types of, sorry, I flipped over there. In response to different types of grazing management and other practices. And we're also developing a soil carbon data management platform that will enable producers to be able to predict how much soil carbon they might be able to build in response to different technologies in Australia. We're also doing some work in trees. So we're developing some decision tools for what species of trees and locations and configurations and densities on farm will lead to maximum co-benefits related to providing increased shade and shelter. So we think that the benefits from that in terms of productivity might even outweigh the benefits that can be achieved from the carbon side of things. And in the northern part of the country, we're looking at similar research, but also how timber production can be integrated to have those same benefits on farm in silver pasture systems. So I discussed the integrated management systems work area a little bit a few slides ago, but one of the major activities that we've done in regard to this, which is really related to leadership building as well, is our pilot carbon accounting workshops. So we ran these through last year, and we used the outcomes from the workshops to improve the current carbon accounting tool that we sort of direct producers and other stakeholders to use. And we also developed a technical manual to support the use of that tool. Work in this area is ongoing, so there's a few other activities that we want to develop. Particularly, we want to develop an online e-learning resource that's really user-friendly. So carbon accounting is technical and complicated, and just like you might need a lawyer for legal advice, generally producers are needing to get help from agricultural advisors and consultants for use of the carbon accounting tool as well. And Landcare's also run quite a number of workshops looking at benchmarking and carbon accounting through this year too. And as I said, we're working with the federal government on ensuring that what we're doing is supporting the frameworks that underpin their carbon markets. And we're also, there's a lot happening in the carbon space. And so we're really trying to stay on top of current research. And as different findings come out about ways to measure greenhouse gases and other things, we will use that information to make any additional targets that we need to include as part of CN30 or make amendments as required in response to new knowledge. Won't spend a lot of time on industry leadership building, only to mention again that we're embedding adoption pathways and other activities into all of our research. And within the carbon storage partnership, we're developing a carbon edge workshop package. So this will be piloted through next year and will hopefully be available by the end of next year, but it will be sort of a 2 to 3 day workshop that takes producers through carbon accounting, but also through the various technologies and practices that are relevant to them. And we're sort of doing similar work with embedding adoption into research across a lot of our other programs. So we're also looking at that in the NB2 Northern Breeding Business Program and the Livestock Productivity Partnership as well. This slide just goes through the steps to a carbon neutral position. It used to be 5 steps. I added the first one because I think it's really important that people understand why they're looking into carbon neutrality. Understanding if you're doing this just because there's the CN30 target and you'd like to be involved, or whether you're trying to achieve a premium brand through a supply chain, or whether you're looking to generate credits through the carbon market, is really important because it will inform the steps that you want to take. But then the next step is to establish a baseline. So this is through doing a carbon account. It's a really great benchmarking activity for any livestock production business. Carbon is a fundamental component of livestock production. And so by looking at a carbon account, you can see where there's inefficiencies in carbon. And by trying to increase carbon efficiency, it's going to have benefits across your production system. The next step is to reduce emissions as much as possible. So currently there's options to look at use selection, and at the moment it's looking at things like net feed intake or traits that indicate sort of a higher rate of growth. There's also herd and flock management practices that can be improved, and improved feed quality. And we're obviously hoping that the additives and supplements are going to be available as well within the next couple of years. Next step is to offset the residual emissions that you're not able to reduce through emissions reduction options. And that can be through vegetation planting or building soil carbon. And if you're unable to do this on your own property, then as part of a supply chain, we're hoping that there'll be the ability to be able to use others that are part of your supply chain to offset residual emissions in your own production system, or vice versa. There's also the option to purchase offsets, but as part of, with CN30, this isn't the direction we're hoping to take. We really think that our industry are uniquely positioned to be able to offset all of our emissions within our own production systems, because we're custodians of such a large part of the landscape. And then really important the whole way along to be ensuring that you're measuring and reporting according with the requirements of what you're trying to achieve through looking at carbon neutrality, and then obviously seek advice. So talk to farm advisors and carbon developers who know what they're talking about and can help you make decisions with your progress. So we've already seen a few organisations come out with carbon neutral brands. In all cases, these companies have done their baseline, so they've done their carbon account, and then they've purchased offsets to offset their residual emissions. But in all cases, this is part of a longer term plan. So they see that they've got a good opportunity to get a carbon neutral brand now. So they've relied on purchasing offsets, but they've also got plans to integrate a number of the other activities that we've talked about, so that over time they can reduce their reliance on those purchased offsets until they can get to a position where they can achieve carbon neutrality within their own system. And this is what we're hoping for the whole of industry. Just touching now on a couple of the other sustainability initiatives that we support at MLA. So there's obviously the Australian beef and the Australian sheep sustainability frameworks that have been really good for our industry to demonstrate the action that we take in alignment with environmental sustainability and other aspects of sustainability as well. We've also recently published a little booklet called Red Meat Green Facts. That's a really cool one-stop shop to respond to those queries that you get in the pub about red meat and its impacts on the environment. And the Australian Good Meat Red website is a really great resource, particularly for students and people that are looking for some of the real information about the red meat industry. So I'll just leave with a vision for our industry's future. So we really think that with all of these initiatives that we're undertaking and supporting, that we're going to be able to really demonstrate that our industry has a really positive story to tell in terms of environmental sustainability. And we think that by 2030, not only will we have achieved carbon neutrality, but consumers will buy Australian red meat because they know that it's good for the environment. So that's it for me. I really hope I didn't talk for too long there and that I've left enough time for Bart.
No worries. Thank you, Margaret. That was fantastic and a lot of information, and very interesting to see where the MLA is going there. And particularly for me, I love the idea of seaweed burps coming from our cows. So it's fantastic. Now, also, your presentation will be available after this webinar, so we'll make sure that the participants get that one. So thank you again, Margaret. That was really good. Okay, so over to Bart. Bart Davidson is our next guest speaker. He's the co-founder and chief grazing officer at MaiaGrazing. Bart has had over 15 years experience working with land managers across a diverse range of farming operations, from low input certified organic systems to intensive dairy, irrigated cotton and grain producers. So thank you, Bart. You've got a lot of experience under your wings there, and yeah, we're really interested to hear the introduction to MaiaGrazing online tool. So if you want to take over for now, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Jenny, and great to follow on from Margaret. And I hope my audio and visuals coming through. I ask you not to fear. I'm not in a coffin. I'm actually in an unusual office today. I do have an escape hatch, so hence the unusual background. So look, thanks very much, Jenny. I'll kick on into this interesting conversation, and I think I'll just begin by giving a bit of context, because I think everybody on the call is going to be somewhere on that range there, from a passing interest through to taking steps, being in the depths of practice change, or possibly all the way through to outcomes. And I think Margaret did a great job of highlighting the kind of breadth that is in this subject of carbon neutrality, carbon credits, carbon monetisation, the carbon economy that seems to be evolving relatively quickly. And I would just say that in my experience and in our experience with Maia, what really matters here, because this is changing, this is a rapidly changing space, and I guess that's always going to be the case when both government, regulation, and the broader economy start bringing in incentives and there's money involved. That tends to change the equation. And I think Margaret made a really good point that you've got to start. You've got to start at the start. You've got to be really clear on why you're doing what you're doing. And I would only say here that where I've seen very successful journeys toward carbon monetisation, carbon credits, carbon neutrality, not that there's a massive array of them out there at the moment, they are coming on though. And where they've been successful, there's been a very clear and conscious decision to chase something really critical, and that's profitability, production, drought resilience, business resilience, people resilience. And then the outcome of that has been a lot of the things that Margaret pointed out, and it could be wrapped into the simple comment of carbon neutrality or carbon monetisation. I think it's a really critical step to get right, because I think that those who go chasing the dollars here are going to come unstuck. You've got to be very clear on what you're trying to do and why, and it's got to be about the production system first. I'll just put this up. I was tempted to put it at the end, but I'll begin with this because it's a farm that I have first-hand familiarity with and have watched evolve over a decade or so. And this is a really good example of what I just said. This was a business that made a few headlines earlier in 2021 with a reasonably significant carbon credit from Microsoft, one of the first of its kind around the world. And look, forwards a bit of a path that is still evolving, because all of the bits and pieces revolving around carbon neutrality, monetisation, projects, measurement. This is not pinned down. This is evolving post haste. And what I'd like to say about the Wilmot Cattle Co and their example in this space is that they sought very early on to be clear on their goals, and that was to build resilience, to get clear on their production system and to establish data. It began with soils, it went on into everything, quite an array of measurables. And as Stu will keep telling me, you can't manage what you can't measure. And he's dead right, that that's where it began for this business, and they would not have achieved the gains that they have without that focus. And then they followed the path of training, advice, and development, and they went at it hard. Right? They do not do anything half-hearted in that regard, or any regard here really, and that's why I think they've been more successful than the average Joe, if that's a fair thing to say. And it's because they took on training their people, they took on training themselves, they took on advice, they took on structure, they took on framework, they took on measurement of a lot of things, and they took on property development, which means doing stuff, water and wire, breaking paddocks up, enterprise selection, basically implement change, as I've noted there on the right, and go at it and realise that they're not going to get it right first time. Realise that it's a process, and that without a feedback loop in various ways that we'll touch on, they wouldn't have been able to get to the end goal, which in their case, the end result, which in their case was a carbon credit, not just neutrality. And I think giving a lot of folks a good incentive to get into the space. I was reminded of this chart I put together, and I need to update obviously because the last number there is 2017. So that trend has actually continued at Wilmot, and I can put this up because I was actually involved with the soil measurement there since 2010-11. And the reason I put this up is because the carbon gains that business was rewarded for with a carbon credit was not black and white. It wasn't some big overnight deal. It was actually just a slow, incremental, steady progression towards effectively doubling their carbon from 2011 to 2020, 2021. And the reason I put this up here is because what's really critical to understand, and I think generally is understood, but often gets gets lost in the graft, is that the key component of getting to that carbon outcome was grazing management. And it's that grazing management which is the link between the animal stuff, the livestock stuff, which is a broad subject in itself, and Margaret did a great job of canvassing its depth, in terms of efficiencies to be gained through genetics, supplementation, and on it goes, through to the carbon capture measurements, models, which in itself is a massive subject. The critical thing that we learned at Wilmot, and have at other properties too, but more specifically here as a good example, is that grazing was the link between those two. The way the animals were driven around the farm on an ongoing, consistent basis was absolutely critical to the outcome. And that's just a nice introduction to where I wanted to go today, and where those of you in the Landcare group on the call will find yourselves exploring in great depth, and hopefully productive depth over the coming time. And there's a bit of detail in this. I won't unpack it. This, I've spent a couple of decades learning from these wonderful people at RCS. And sure, there are variations of detail here, but my key point here is that this is the grazing deal. This is the stuff. These 6 principles are essentially the meat and potatoes of how that prior example I put up was able to implement change, measure change, and then be rewarded for change. And I will just say that rather than work through each of these 6, because most of you will as part of your ongoing training, I highly encourage you to take as deeply as you can. What I will say is that the important thing about this slide is that you know what you don't know, right? I'm still learning the nuance. The fact is that the triple black belt ninja graziers around the world are working out how to best implement these 6 principles, and over time and at points in time work out where the priority is, where the emphasis needs to be placed, and where the learning needs to come from, because it really is about the management of supply and demand, time and space, and animal performance to arrive at the place where we've got gains in natural capital, as they'll say, and production, and the animal. So I've pinched another great slide from RCS, and it's just too good an example of what we're trying to talk about here. And by referencing the grazing component of how this hangs together, that link between the animal and the carbon outcome, that natural capital outcome, there is no better way of explaining it than this, in that in all of the pastures of all of the extensive and intensive rangelands around the world right now, they are generally somewhere between these three extremes. On the left, we've got continuous grazing 10 metres away from what we will call, somewhat ideal grazing that is part of those 6 principles we just put up before. And then on the right, again, just a number of yards away through a fence, is no grazing. So we've got overgrazing, ideal grazing, and no grazing. And you can see the massive difference in the roots. It's really just a beautiful visualization of what we're trying to talk about here, because our goal is to feed the animal, obviously. Our goal is to meet the production targets. And now that there is the conversation market and energy around carbon, where's it going to come from? Well, it's going to come from photosynthesizing plants, translocating and moving carbon back down through their systems, hopefully to depth, to stable structures that doesn't disappear with rain, flood, fire, feast and famine, pestilence. And that's one of the beautiful things that we are seeing, that we can actually influence significantly that root zone, that deeper root zone carbon accumulation through the plant. And how do we manage that? Well, it's got to be through the animal, and through the animal means through the herd, the mob, the group of animals. That's our tool for managing how we run the business. And there's no better way of explaining that. And ultimately, the goal is to keep it in phase 2. Okay, and again, that's a whole other conversation that deserves a lot more time than I'm giving it today. But that's an encapsulation of what we're seeking to see here. So I'll give us all a bit of a slap in the face here, because this is the reality. This is just me in my little cave where I go and get data and I play with things and I say, well, how's everybody going? And this is all farms in all locations around the world, and we're primarily New South Wales, Queensland, east coast of Australia, but we've got a bunch of farms, properties and animals around the world in multiple continents, and they all face the same problem. Just the exaggerations and the sensitivities are slightly different, but at the end of the day, the result in front of us here is that the majority of people, which is really to say the majority of properties, spend the majority of their time either overstocked or understocked. And it's a problem. You're not going to build carbon levels or achieve the other goals that we've got to do with the natural asset, the capital asset of the farm, let alone production goals, if we are well overstocked or well understocked. So at any given point in time, the averages of this are roughly that people are spending 10 to 15% of their time on the money. And this is data for all properties in Maia in their first year of Maia data. Now, it might shock you, but it's really, we see it in the landscape around us. And this is just making a ratio of actual stocking rate to carrying capacity at points in time per property, made as a ratio, normalised to rainfall. So rainfall comes out of the equation. It's where those properties should be versus where they are at the time. Now, I'll just quickly, I try and be a simple person, and this is going to be my very simple reason for why I think that doesn't happen, why that does happen, and why we don't actually achieve the goals that we have on a more consistent basis, week in, week out. I mean, on the call, I'm sure we've got people that inherited the farm from Bill, who inherited the farm from Bob, who inherited the farm from Jenny, and through to people that have come on in the last 6 months. And at the end of the day, everybody's got a mental model around how this farm works, or these farms that we work on, how they work. And it's fascinating to me that I can talk to someone in Alaska all the way through to the US, Southern America, anywhere in Australia. And it's relatively the same, except that the depth of this chart varies and the frequency and the sensitivities change between north, south, east and west. And at the end of the day, our job is to grow feed through the growing season and then work out how to best burn that feed down through our non-growing season, so that we arrive at the end of the season with not quite an empty tank, plenty of ground cover, plenty of resilience in the pasture to get up and go again when we get that trigger in spring or whatever the system in that we're growing in is. Simple, right? We've all got a mental model for how that looks on our farm, when it rains, when we wean, when we join, all the rest of it. But I've got to say, my life is a joy because all I get to do is look at data. And I could pull this up for pretty well anywhere that you people are. And I've just grabbed one here as an example. But whether it's a winter dominant rainfall system or a summer dominant or somewhere in between, our expectations of how things work around here based on long-term average or medians or what dad or grandfather used to talk about generally doesn't happen. And as we move into a world with greater volatility around climate, seasonality, and extremes, as we've certainly seen, I've had 2 floods in the last 10 years with 1.5 meters of water through my house. So I've certainly seen plenty of it, and I think that it's just an element that we need to manage. And my point there is that you will not achieve the goals that you've got for production and land stewardship if you are just simply working off your mental model and nothing else. I think that world's gone. So I often hear that the problem is the weather, the problem is the drought, the problem is La Nina, the problem is El Nino. The problem isn't there. The problem really is being in a position to do as well as we can with the season that we actually get versus the one that we want or expect or hope for. And then having the decision-making framework in place so that we make the right call, we pull the trigger, we gear up or we get out, we do what we need to do, we find land, we get adjustment, we wean early, we do what we need to do, or take on risk because we know that we've got a bunch of confidence to do so. And I'm summarising here what we see through the Maya experience, just conceptually, in terms of how to do that. The people that I work with on a regular, consistent basis, and we work with our vast array of lovely customers, beautiful people that we're constantly learning from and with. Things change. It changes how we think, and we have to change how we think. If we're going to go back to those 6 principles that were put up earlier, we've got to take principle and we've got to apply it to framework. Otherwise, we're just shooting from the hip and really just it'll be dumb luck if we get to where we want to go. And I don't say that lightly. And the things that will change are how we think about time. It goes from numbers on a calendar where we are due to move the weaners or to do the joining to actually thinking about grass through the prism of yield and recovery. Sounds inane, but it's a really big shift in thinking. All about yield and recovery when we're thinking about time. And then the animals go from individuals and subsets and tag colours and so on through to being the landscaping tool. Mobs, herds, animal impact, whether in leader or followers or other configurations. We've seen them all. And at the end of the day, unless the concept around animals changes to one where they are a tool in the toolkit to be managed and nurtured, and well, no doubt about it in terms of their ability to achieve weight gain and biological cycles. But that's a big change that happens. And ultimately people end up having, funnily enough, less mobs as they go down this journey, more manageable number of mobs for different targeted periods of time. And the last one there is paddocks, where, parcels of land go from being just a paddock to actually grass inventory, whether it's during the growing season and we're stacking that grass inventory, or whether it's the non-growing season and we're basically consuming it to get through to the other end. That's what a paddock becomes. So how that looks, I struggled to kind of break this down into its simplest parts and not make it sound dumb and not make it sound complicated, but essentially how we do what we do and how we follow those principles that I laid out there before, the 6 principles of grazing management. We are, in essence, taking single events at points in time that everybody does. We all do the rain, we all do the moves, we all do the bits and pieces, but then thread a story through that and do it. In Maya, we do that through the beauty of code. Others can do it in an Excel, others can do it on the back of their hand with a bit less efficiency. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is saying, it's not just about the single event, it's about the story. And in this particular example on the top right here, we've got a story around daily rainfall becoming monthly rainfall, which is relatively useful, but at the end of the day, not really. Until in October 2021, we want to know where we are versus October 2020. And in this particular example, we've gone from 765 millimetres of rolling rainfall to 1,008 on this particular farm. It could have been the opposite. On every farm, it's, the volatility that we've had in the last 24 months, it'll be each side of extremes. Point being that rolling rainfall is then the thing that we need to normalise against. It's not an average year. So step 2 there is the moves. You know, we all move animals around. We are all, whether it's to a structure or ad hoc or planned or otherwise, those moves become the rolling history of yield, recovery, density and duration that are embodied in those principles that I pointed out before. And the beauty again of actually just having a framework that we can apply these principles to means that the story comes out, which we'll see. And in terms of the planning, the very simple act, we see this time and time again, the very simple act of saying, okay, it's October the, whatever, what is it today? The 13th, I think. Where are we for the next 150 days? Where are we for the next 100 days? Who's going to eat what? Sounds inane, but that simple act of consciously deciding who's going to eat what, which therefore forces us to work out time and space, because we've got to allocate feed and we've got to give grass recovery period. We've got to manage density. We've got to basically get on top of how we, at a paddock level, decide who eats what. Now, it's true to say that about a third of farmers do that in our experience, because it's another step. People would rather do the tax than they'd rather do the planning sometimes. And it's a defining point of difference between those who do not end up in trouble versus those that do. And we're talking here about getting past the point of being in trouble. We're talking about the point of going towards carbon neutrality and building carbon levels, which we will not do if we're not keeping our plants in phase 2, which we're not going to do unless we've got absolute confidence in our decisions around our stocking rate and how the animals are grazing through time and space. Another view of that now is the stocking rate to carrying capacity, which was principle 3 on that prior list. And this in itself is a couple of days conversation. And all I've done here is just give a quick visual, simplified version and visualization of a specific farm, one of a gazillion that I could have put up, where in this case, they've gone from being slightly overstocked late 2019 to understocked, because all of a sudden we've gone from the depths of drought to better seasons, and they've been running to catch up to those better seasons for their farm, for their data, for their rainfall, for their capacity to turn rainfall into grass and harvest it, which is what the carrying capacity is. And ultimately it's about knowing where you are versus where you should be. And then I always love to see on the right-hand side there, that absolutely critical function here, which is to bring the past into the future and have a plan for being where we want to be, whether we're understocked now or overstocked now. And that's the power of balancing stocking rate to carrying capacity that hopefully you're all embarking on learning how to implement. So in terms of how MaiaGrazing looks, I've just covered those basic principles in some visuals. And essentially we tie together that those moving parts, those elements of rainfall, livestock inventory, changes to that, which happens so frequently, but to bring that back to a grazing chart up on the top right, and then ultimately to a stocking rate per 100 mils per hectare per 100 mils versus the carrying capacity. And that's the key thing here, being able to have confidence in making the decisions that are the big ones, that are the defining decisions around not just production, but also relationship to banks, to lending, to partners, just to stress. We all forget now the stress of 2019 in Eastern Australia, and can relate to the stress in the US at the moment with drought. It's a horrible, insidious thing that creeps up on people in the absence of a decision-making framework that says, you know what, it's not about me, it's not about my judgment, it's about the numbers. Let's just do what we've got to do. So I'll round out by saying that we've accrued a bunch of data, and we can learn from that data. I could have chosen a bunch of things to point out here, but just going back to those grazing principles that have strong links back to that carbon accrual and that carbon story that this webinar began with. And I'll just quickly point out a couple of good examples where we've tracked through individual paddocks and properties right through to the entire database, that movement of large paddocks, large number of mobs, not really getting grazing management, not really getting control over those 6 principles that we talked about, and looked at the data before and after, which was actually part of a Landcare conference and a holistic management conference not that long ago with RCS. The results are really basic, right? All I'll say is that by targeting those principles that we talked about in terms of planning, getting control over recovery, and density, stocking rate to carrying capacity, there's the headline number is 26% increase in yield, where density increased. There's increase in a reduction in paddock size, a reduction in mobs, and on and on. But basically, there's this positive feedback loop that's going on, and it comes out in production. And funnily enough, that then flows through to the ecosystem, the landscape. And I'll finish on this one, I think, where we spent a bunch of time looking at individual grazers through time and doing the data thing, and really just wanted to encourage you by saying this is, at first glance, quite a complicated chart. It's really trying to describe, it is describing the relationship between time and density. So paddocks being rested, paddocks having high density. So on the bottom left, we've got low recovery periods between grazers and low density. Top left is where most people are, and then top right is where those 6 principles will take people, using livestock to essentially work with their production goals and the carbon cycle in terms of keeping the majority of pastures in phase 2 for as long as possible. And when you go to the actual results of that, it's pretty fascinating that the actual yield, which just means whether it's measured in stock days, pounds per acre, kilos per hectare of dry matter per 100 mils, that green section was achieving 41, the rotation with rest 31, and the conventional low recovery, low density was 22. So there's a significant difference in actual production. And back to my prior example, it started with the Wilmot Cattle Co. That's been their journey from the bottom left up through the top left to the right. And it is the journey for so many that we could point at. And that's how they've achieved their carbon, or their natural capital goals of basically building the resilience of the pastures, building that whole ecosystem and landscape, which, funnily enough, ends up in more grass per unit of rain. So I'll finish there, and not sure how my timing was, but basically just trying to give a quick overview of a very broad and deep subject that is hopefully giving some encouragement and enthusiasm to folks just absolutely getting in their hammer and tongs and having a good hard go at this, because it's really, there's a world of opportunity in front of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bart. Yeah, as you said, there was, you know, there's a lot of information, and you've done extremely well to condense it down for us. But that was a fantastic presentation, and you know, any sort of tool that helps make those tough decisions for farmers a little bit easier and clearer, you know, is a good thing. So thank you very much for that, and of course, you know, we'll be able to send out some more links if people are looking for more information. We'll just, so we did have a question come through. Margaret, if you're there still, if you want to just turn your camera on, if that's possible, but we can still see your screen. Great, there, everyone's there. Thank you. Margaret, did you just want to sort of summarise that question that did come through, if possible?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Jenny, because I did type a long-winded answer, but I was trying to listen to Bart at the same time. Yeah. So I'm worried that I'll say something stupid that's in writing now, and you'll all hold it against me. But look, I guess the question was about Asparagopsis, and there are challenges with how to grow it. It has to be grown in specific environments. And so what does that mean in terms of environmental costs, but, you know, transport costs and business case related costs for adoption of that technology as well? And is it better for graziers to just focus on legumes and other supplements that might be a little bit, have a better return on investment? So look, Asparagopsis has potential to be a really great product, but there is still a lot of work to do on developing that business case. So we don't yet know what the cost of the final commercialized product might be, or even what format it's going to be. So they're exploring whether it's suspended in oil, or if it's water soluble, or if it's a lick block or something else for grazing animals. So that work all does need to be done. We do see that additives is really important. So essentially, what happens when livestock eat feed is that a lot of the energy from from the pasture is converted into live weight gain, but a lot of it is also lost as the byproduct of methane. So what these additives are trying to do is direct that part of the energy from feed that's being lost as a byproduct into a weight gain advantage. So we do see that there's significant potential for some of these additives to be really important technology for our industry as we're trying to get to CN30. However, all of the practices that are available are important. So we're not singling out any one. There's going to be practices that are appropriate for different businesses based on what type of business they are wanting to do. Does it fit in with their organic production system, if that's what they're looking for? And of course, return on investment, which is going to be concerned with transport costs and other things. Yeah, I guess that readily available is the ability to use legumes and other high quality pastures, and also herd management. And I suggested some of the others through my presentation too. But the additives and supplements are something that we still want to focus on because of the potential to really help us make significant gains, particularly if we're wanting to grow the herd and flock in size as well. So if we're wanting to increase production, then to achieve the goals for industry, we also need to have those significant reductions in methane production.
I'd just like to say thank you very much to of course, Bart and Margaret for your time and information today. We really, ACT and NRM really appreciate it. And also thank you to the MaiaGrazing team, especially Sheeta, for helping us pull this together, and the team from ACT and NRM as well, Mary and Anna. Thank you very much for that. Thank you to everyone. Have a safe day, and we'll hope to see you at our next webinar.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Margaret.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Bart. See you, everyone.
Thank you.